leg amputation has been around for almost all of human history. Um, People have been losing their legs in battle or just in regular everyday accidents or disease. And so there's a few different kinds of leg amputations that we have today. We have amputation of the foot, which is partial foot amputation or maybe part of the toes or something like that. We have amputation at the leg or at the ankle, which is amputation at the ankle joint, which would remove all of the foot. We have below the knee, which is anywhere between the knee joint and the ankle joint. We have at the knee, which is amputation at the knee joint. Then we have above the knee, which is between the hip socket and the knee joint. And then we have at the hip, which is at the hip socket, and it removes the entire leg. And so given that there has always been amputation, trying to create fake limbs has always been a logical and natural progression of thought. And the idea of prosthetic limbs is not as new as people would think. I thought it was a fairly new concept, but turns out it's been around for much of human history. The oldest prosthetic leg that we have found is from 300 BCE. It was discovered in Capua, Italy in 1858. It was made of bronze and iron, and it had a wooden core and appeared to be for a below-the-knee amputation. The oldest record we have of a prosthetic limb comes from the writings of Herodotus, and he said that a Persian seer once amputated his own foot to escape a death sentence, and he made a wooden filler for himself so that he could walk to the next town about 30 miles away. And then next came the peg leg in the Dark Ages, and it was mostly for battle, people that had to fight in battle to serve a specific purpose, like maybe to ride a horse, so that they could fill both stirrups and keep their balance, or it was for the wealthy, who really only wanted it for a kind of psychosomatic sense of purpose, ease of walking, but it wasn't very functional. It was more for a sense of completeness than anything else. And then came Perret. Perret was a Frenchman in the army who was a barber/surgeon, and he was in the 1500s. And he's largely considered to be the father of modern prosthetics and amputation surgery. And so before him, they thought that gunpowder would poison the blood. And so when they had an amputation, they would cauterize it using boiling oil because they thought that would stop the spread of this poison that they believed to be in gunpowder. But Perret didn't think that was the case, and turns out he was right. He was the first to implement ligatures, which is where around the amputated site, they would seal off the capillaries and the veins and all the blood vessels to help prevent blood loss, because a lot of amputees in that day were just dying of blood loss. And Perret watched as these soldiers who came off the battlefield with fewer limbs than they went in with were just distraught and felt like they could never move on from this, and they ended up killing themselves. And he was really disturbed by this, and so he decided he was going to try and make prosthetics for them. And so he really focused more on functionality than just giving someone something as a placeholder. And he designed legs with a knee joint that could be locked straight for standing still and unlocked to be able to bend, and had an adjustable harness to keep it in place so that it could be securely fastened onto the leg, but then also removed at the end of the day, because they weren't particularly comfortable. Also during this time, he had a colleague named Lorraine, who was a locksmith in Paris, and he made another really great stride in modernizing prosthetic legs by using leather, paper, and glue instead of things like iron and bronze and steel, which were very heavy and bulky and just not very comfortable or easy for the amputee to work with. Then the 17th through the 19th centuries saw a number of different improvements, but most were based on Perret's design. In 1800, James Potts made a leg with a steel knee joint connected to the ankle by catgut tendons. And catgut tendons are these cords that are made from the intestines of animals like sheep or horses or something like that. And doing that allowed the ankle to be flexed when the knee joint bent. A lot of different changes were made cosmetically as well. Things like covering up the mechanisms, putting the tendons inside of, say, like a leather covering or something like that. And this just made people feel a little bit more comfortable with the idea of having a prosthetic. It looked a little more natural, a little bit more like a human leg. So it made them feel a little bit more whole and like they weren't missing something as bad. And then the DeSoto brothers, one of whom was an amputee himself, started using aluminum in prosthetics, which was significantly lighter than steel and iron, so it was way more convenient and way easier for the amputee to walk around with. And then came the Civil War, World War I, and World War II, which saw a way big increase in demand for prosthetics, and thus it saw improvements. After World War II, the government made a deal with the military-related companies to, instead of pursuing weapons improvements, they would pursue improvements in prosthetics. And that made a big improvement towards modern prosthetics, like these. Modern prosthetics use aluminum, plastic, and other composite materials, as well as microprocessors, computer chips, and robotics to help with movement. Some opt for a silicone-covered prosthetic, which just makes it look a little bit more like skin, so they look a little bit more like the average non-amputee. And then there's also runner's blades, which are more for running and athletic endeavors. They work by, they're like a spring. So when the runner steps down, these blades will compress and store potential energy, and then when they shift their weight off of that leg, it decompresses, pushing that energy out into kinetic energy. And the different components in today's prosthetic legs are a pylon, which is this part. It's usually in the straight part of the leg, like the shins, something like that. And it uses usually some kind of metal. It's the support system. It has to be able to support the full weight of the amputee, and it will attach to the socket and the foot part. Then the socket surrounds the remaining part of the leg, and it makes it fit onto the leg, and it's custom made for each patient so that it fits as securely as possible. And then there's the suspension system, and that's what keeps it attached while still being removable. Most leg amputations of today use a suction and vacuum technique, which creates an airtight seal in between the socket and the leg. But then there's also the harness system, which is old-fashioned. It's what we've used for most of history, and it utilizes a harness system attached to different parts of the body to keep it in place while still remaining removable. Then for joints, there are electric leg joints, which sense and track a person's gait so that they can predict when they need to move based on where the joint is in the gait cycle. And some joints, usually knees, utilize a MEDI OMF2 system, which locks when the person is standing, but when they sense a shift of the weight off of the prosthetic, the knee joint unlocks and it's able to be moved. And the more we progress, the more we are moving into what's called myoelectric limbs, which utilize the electrical impulses that our brain sends out into the rest of our body to make our body do things, and it hooks that up to the prosthetic limb so that it can sense that, and so your brain can control it. So the first thing that anyone needs to go through in the process of getting a prosthetic leg is assessing their K level, which is used by Medicare and insurance companies and also doctors to determine what kind of prosthetic leg they need and how much it's going to cost them. So level 0 is unlikely to be able to use a prosthetic leg, so one won't be prescribed. Level 1 is low activity level. Walking is on level surfaces at an even gait, usually just around the home. Level 2 is low activity, but a little bit more, with moderate terrain, usually curbs, stairs, or some other uneven surfaces, but it's usually still not very active. It's walking around town, that kind of thing. Level 3 needs to be able to handle more than simple locomotion, so things like mild exercise or physical therapy, something like that. And level 4 is high energy and high stress levels on the prosthetic, so it's usually for children, athletes, or particularly active adults. The cost is typically $5,000 to $50,000 for a prosthetic leg, but the legs are only intended to be used for about 3 to 5 years before they're replaced. So this puts a really big strain on amputees because they might not have insurance, or insurance might not cover the full cost. So it's very difficult for them, but the more we move towards things like universal health care, then it could make the lives of amputees a lot easier. Then references.